a biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, we're back today talking about mature views of government, and today some focus on how Christian responsibility looks on rolling back the welfare state. Andrew McColl has been really immersed in this whole issue around having a mature view of government, and some of the segments we've had of recent times have just been outstanding. Andrew is the Family Voice Australia State Director for Queensland, back with us. Hey Andrew, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thank you, Neil. Good morning to you and good morning to our listeners.
Andrew, before we get into some of the biblical foundation that I know you love to talk about when you're talking about these issues around government, if you saw the whole thing, that the Trump-Harris debate was aired yesterday and it's all over the media today. Everyone's talking about it. For some people, that's like a little bit confronting because, hey, it's happening on the other side of the world. Of course, it does mean things for us here in Australia as well. But if you did see the debate, you would have noticed, and something that other media outlets are not really talking about, they're picking up on things like eating pets and things like that. But there are some things that would be around the government handouts to stimulate the economy and the sorts of promises that come from both sides, and whether you think you're siding with the Republicans, which might be Donald Trump, or the Democrats, Kamala Harris, you might have noticed even some similarities there. Did you have an impression on that US presidential debate, Andrew? And of course, when we talk about welfare state, it certainly does highlight some issues there. What were your thoughts?
Well, it certainly does, Neil. And what we do know is that it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about the Democrats or the Republicans. What we have in the US, and it's been this way for many decades now, is a general acceptance that the government must look after you. It must not just look after you in terms of what is considered to be legitimate scripturally. It must actually care for you in ways where it becomes your provider. And this introduces us to something of our subject today. But when we know that the US government has to borrow $1 trillion every 100 days because it's spending more money than it's taking in taxation, and it's been doing this for generations, you know that this can't go on forever. There will be a point. If you or I, Neil, take our credit card and just max it out every day of the week, there comes a point where someone says to you, Neil, I think it's over. You can't keep doing this. Now's the time to stop and cut that stupid thing up. And not only to cut up your credit card, but now also we're going to have some pretty strict controls on how you do things, because you're owing 100,000, 200,000 on your credit card, and the bank just says, that's it, mate, no more of that. So we understand that, and also that much of what we see in these debates is the triumph of shadow over substance. It's to give an impression to the listener or to the viewer, which may or may not actually be very truthful at all. And so you understand that it's basically for sort of visual impact and somewhat some verbal impact. But meanwhile, back at the ranch, both of the parties are quite happy to act as if life is a spend-a-thon, and especially when you're spending other people's money. And yet there's no relation to the fact that the money actually is already gone, and we're now just trying to play games about how we conceal the fact that there's so much debt and it's not stopping.
Okay, and let's not be ignorant of the fact that we've got our own debt issues here in Australia, and it's not necessarily our focus for the conversation today, because we want to get into a biblical foundation, and is there a godly wisdom that comes around these sorts of issues around a welfare state? And I know you like to talk about what you're calling a politics of allurement. And I wonder if we might start, as you like to, with where the scripture might have some wisdom around the welfare state, and where we as Christian believers might need to either be preparing now for a time when we take more of that responsibility, or when a time when we're forced to take more of that responsibility. Where do you want to start here, Andrew?
Well, I thought I'd start this morning just reading from Proverbs chapter 1, verses 10 to 19, where Solomon gave us this warning. He said, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, 'Come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole, as those who go down to the pit. We will find all kinds of precious wealth. We will fill our houses with spoil. Throw in your lot with us, we shall all have one purse. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from their path. For their feet run to evil and they hasten to shed blood. Indeed, it is useless to spread the baited net in the sight of any bird, but they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. It takes away the life of its possessors." So what I really say today, Neil, is the politics of the West's welfare states, and that's across pretty much every state of the West, are the politics of allurement, whereby trusting souls get taken on a very dangerous ride. There's nothing new about this. It's been happening for thousands of years, at least since an invader of Israel promised the people of Jerusalem in Isaiah chapter 36, verses 16 and 17, "Make your peace with me, and come out to me, and eat each of his vine and each of his fig tree, and drink each of the waters of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards." Now, in Roman times, governments promised bread and circuses. That's what they thought the people wanted. But they also debased the currency, causing inflation. Why would they do that? They thought they could. Would governments still cause inflation today? Of course they do.
So, in some sense here, when people might have doubts about the relevancy of biblical godly wisdom, in some sense, the dates might change, the currencies might change, but the same issues of the heart are still at work. How does this all look for today if you're applying some of those biblical ideas to a present situation?
Well, Neil, the only things that really change are the dates and details. Grand political promises are still being made in Australia to voters, but with the passing of time, these prove to be exceedingly difficult to fulfil. And here's the problem. Well, it's the first problem, and that is that God doesn't give grace to governments to solve all problems, but to deal with law and order, weights and measures, and little else. So in Romans chapter 13, verse 4, the Bible refers to the state as a minister of God to you for good, that does not bear the sword for nothing. So justice is a state task to deal with. Does the modern state want to do it? Well, rarely, and when it does, it tends to have its own distorted view of what it considers justice to be. So, has anyone been following the costs of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or the NDIS, lately? It was once budgeted at $13 billion. It's now supposed to be costing $42 billion and growing at 20% annually. Are you thrilled that Mr. Shorten has access to the money jar that you're paying into, the one purse that Solomon warned us of in our text from Proverbs chapter 1? Is it good economics? Well, why would governments that ignore God and his word be concerned about that? So that's why we have today the politics of plunder, and it's been that way for thousands of years.
And I'm sure it's not going to miss with some listeners to know that Bill Shorten just this past week has announced he's leaving politics and taking up a role as a university vice-chancellor in the ACT. But some have laughed that off and saying, well, the big problems with the NDIS, Bill's handballing those on to his successor. And so that will be a big challenge. And of course, getting the balance there of caring for the needs of those who genuinely have disabilities and those who might be, as has been suggested, rorting the system. That's a big challenge. Hey, what are the sorts of precedents you think of for change into this sort of idea of taking responsibility back for some of the welfare as Christian individuals and as families and as communities?
Well, what we do know, Neil, is that for any community, there are a multitude of vital tasks that actually require individuals, families, and churches. Now, some of this is voluntary. For instance, the Bible records the use of nurses and midwives in both Genesis chapter 35 and Exodus chapter 1. These ladies did their job as privately employed professionals serving godly people. The early church cared for its widows in Acts chapter 6. Isn't that interesting? Do these three texts teach us something? What if God's people did that today? And let's face it, the scripture does warn us that if anyone does not care for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That's 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. So what if through biblical Christian responsibility we began to arrest the trend towards bigger government and centralised decision-making, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of kilometres away from different people around Australia? And what if this led to individuals and families having more control over their lives with the building of important bonds within families and communities? And here's the big one. What if this led to you and I, long term, having more money in our pocket through reduced taxation because our governments were compelled to cut back on their services? Does that sound like a good idea? But when governments try to expand on God's plan, taking on roles that really belong to the individual, the family and the church, they inevitably become bigger, aggressive and abusive. In Queensland, we've had government commitments on hospitals and highways, schools and youth crime, stadiums, bridges, dams and flood prevention, and of course our taxes as well.
So how has that all worked out as you see things? And you're talking about your own backyard there in Queensland. What's some reasoning around that?
Well, I would say it hasn't worked out very well because, well, there are quite a few reasons, but one of them, Neil, is that decisions are made for political purposes, not always helping people. Now, consider this real-life North Queensland example from just last week from this Katter Party press release. On the same day that the state government is proclaiming its wonderful work ending the lives of more Queenslanders through abortion, the mayor of the Flinders Shire, Councillor Kate Peddle, was in Townsville on extended leave awaiting the birth of her second child more than 400 kilometres away from home and support networks. Being forced to leave home and my support systems weeks before my due date is not just inconvenient, she said, it's isolating and profoundly stressful. If I had a choice, I would be at home with my family, celebrating this precious time together, not feeling abandoned and overwhelmed. What makes this experience all the more galling is reading about the government announcement about encouraging the end of more pregnancies. If the government genuinely wants to assist rural women, they should focus on how to help us bring our babies into the world, not just ways to eliminate them, she said. So the member for Traeger, Robbie Katter, the second largest electorate in Queensland, covering almost 430,000 square kilometres, said that mental health is a critical concern, yet no one is addressing the impacts of forced separation for rural and remote women forced to give birth away from their community. Mr. Katter said, "We need maternity services and counselling services immediately to preserve lives, not just state-supported ways to end it." And Neil, this bears out what Rushdoony wrote. He said, "The more power and money an individual or an enterprise gains, the more effectively it functions, because people and businesses have a productive function which thrives on further capitalisation. However, this is not true of the state. The more power and money the state gains, the less effectively it functions, because it feeds on power and money, not to function in terms of a productive end, but to enhance its power and wealth. Power and wealth give muscles to men, businesses and organisations, but they feed a cancer in the state."
So come back to some of these biblical foundations for a few moments, running a little short of time here, but the sorts of things that we began to talk about, politics of allurement, where do these sorts of things fit as we draw some loose ends together here? You've given some significant illustrations there and highlighted a whole bunch of hypocrisy that happens in politics. How do we conclude a conversation like this around government and mature views of how the Christian thinks about those things and rolling back a welfare state?
Well, just as Solomon warned us in Proverbs chapter 1, we still have Pied Pipers in politics today that play their tune and hope we'll follow them, while they are busily making grand promises to us and all the while confiscating taxes and spending them. We call this a politics of plunder. But if we really want to stop this nonsense, we'll take the necessary steps of responsibility as individuals and family members and members of God's church. Complaining won't actually stop the problems, nor will watching and waiting and sitting on our backside. We have to move from complaining to coming up with godly solutions to the problems that face us. This means individuals, families and the church stepping up to the plate and following the scriptures as we get our hands dirty with a multitude of practical problems. This involves the education of children, medical issues, helping grandpa and granny with lots of tasks we needed because it's important to honour them, along with a multitude of other personal and practical tasks. Yes, it's not without challenge and it will require our time, effort and money. But let's face it, anything of any value always does. But this is what leads to change in the grassroots of the community. And this is how God's people make ourselves relevant. And that's how we turn things around for the good of individuals, families, the church and the community, and for the glory of God, because Psalm 33:12 tells us that blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And as Rushdoony also wrote, Neil, God's requirement is government from the bottom up in terms of his law. It begins with the self-government of the Christian man, with the family as a government, the church, the school, a person's vocation, society and its various voluntary groups and agencies, and finally, civil government, one government among many, unquote. So the opportunities are waiting for us today. The question is, are we ready to start?
And why this is confronting and why this is challenging is that so many of us will say, Andrew, we're glad that there's government welfare support there because we haven't got time to deal with issues to do with family. But there's something that detaches family when we don't take that responsibility. I guess there's something there that has to be more deeply thought through and I guess within families even discussed more widely about how families support one another. Would that be, trying to make sense of how this works in practice? Because it is biblical wisdom, it is godly wisdom, and yet we're so used to this politics of allurement that it's difficult then to go back and take the responsibility. A final word from you on that?
Absolutely. And this is where we need to understand that the politics of allurement only work while the people are believing those promises, and until there's some kind of catastrophe when the system collapses because it got drawn so heavily. The debts are up, and as we were mentioning earlier in the US situation, they have got monumental problems that will not go away with the fact that they're spending much more money than they're taking in. There will be a day of crisis that they face there, and it would happen here the same. So we have to think about all these matters and come back to, well, what does God want me to be doing as an individual and as a family and as a church member? How can we begin to pick up the pieces and really care for people the way he told us to do in his word?
And challenges, aren't there? When you say those sorts of things applied to government, it comes back to the individual responsibility. First of those might be living within your means when it comes to talk about finance. Andrew McColl is the Family Voice Australia State Director for Queensland. You can connect with Andrew at familyvoice.org.au. And we've done a number of segments talking about mature views of government, and we might anticipate that somehow or other, very soon, listeners will be able to access some of those and put them all together and see if they can make sense of some of the bigger picture that you've been talking about. You're also the author of a number of books. Let me just mention some of those. They Shall Become One, The Significance of the Godly Family, Inherit the Earth, and The Great Christian Revolution. We're talking with Andrew McColl. Connect with him at familyvoice.org.au. Andrew, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Always a pleasure, Neil. Thank you so much.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.